Alright everyone, while they worry about Jussie Smollett, or however the fuck you pronounce his name over here, the same people that are very worried about the potential for bigotry and violence here don't care about the fact that you've now got another grisly milestone with the Ebola death toll in the Congo, which is still burning around perilously close to large urban metropolitan areas with world trade and travel. Over 500 people now dead in the epidemic there, and by the way, with a 50% death rate, what does that mean about the number of total cases? It's still rising. It's picking up speed over time. You have a civil war, you have a concurrent outbreak of malaria, you have a lack of availability of virtually everything under the sun with regards to medicine under the best of situations in Central Africa at large. You now have this epidemic marching steadily towards several other national borders, and it's causing panic. It's going to cause order to begin to break down. The economic impact alone, let alone the direct impact due to death, or disfigurement. People who've had Ebola tend to suffer further problems throughout their life. It's sort of like the Black Plague. First generation after the plague of Justinian was crippled as far as their health went. After that, they get a lot better because, you march on, serfdom ends, with the Black Plague later on. It's terrible. A third of Europe's population possibly dies in the epidemic. Now, you could have that with Ebola. The problem is that the world community hasn't yet fully realized the possible full scope of these things, because we're used to saying, well, Ebola, it's that disease that wipes out the odd African village once in a while. No, more like Ebola that has shown now that it is readily capable of mutating. The thing is, the saving grace before is that most of the areas it was endemic to had very little trade and travel. That is, there wasn't air travel in most parts of Central Africa until the 60s and 70s, and even then only in the most major metro areas. Your capital has an airstrip. That's basically the limitation until you get to within the last half century. Also, the population density was quite low in most parts. Now the population density in many parts of Africa is skyrocketing. It's beginning to skyrocket because there's enough modernity and technology now introduced in even the smaller metropolitan areas, so that the birth rate is still very high due to cultural effects. Essentially, people were used to every other child dying, so they'd have 5 or 6 kids, and that was considered a small family, because half of them would die before they hit reproductive age. So the population would grow more slowly. Now, only one of those kids dies. Well, they're still having 6, sometimes 10 kids. 1 or 2 maybe die, the rest of them live, and the next generation more than doubles, potentially, in some of these areas. You look at the nation of Chad, which most of Chad, 90% of it is inhospitable desert. The very, very tiny proportion of it that's even arable is jam-packed. And the population rate, what's the average number of kids? I think it was some insane number, like 14 per woman. And the fact is, half of those women die in childbirth at some point in their life anyway. But if you have 10 kids and only half of them die, you've still more than doubled the resulting population. It's insane. So you have more people, you have more travel, and you have more reservoirs for the disease. You still have the cultural problem of bushmeat consumption in parts of West Africa. In Central Africa, you have a civil war, and so when this disease gets introduced, it's not like if you have a relatively stable area, you have an Ebola outbreak, you quarantine it, you give people serum, you do probably experiments, let's face it, you try to stop it however you can, it burns itself out fairly quickly. The aid workers, they're fully protected. Now try going into a war zone, which is the area that the current Ebola outbreak is in. Those workers might get robbed for medical equipment. Some guerrilla band comes along, steals their equipment, sells it on the black market to buy guns and ammo. They're like, oh, that medical van, I bet if we plated it with a little bit of extra metal, it would make a great makeshift troop transport. Because our enemies are mostly fighting with, last generation small arms, it'd be survivable. Hey, we're going to take that medical van. Oh, there's blood in the back, just mop it out with a sponge or something. Oh, shit, it was from an Ebola patient. Now all of a sudden the whole group of soldiers there, they have Ebola too. And by the way, that group of soldiers, they get Ebola. They're not going to go to the medical experts. You don't even know how many people have died in this outbreak. They've got 500 that they've tabulated. That doesn't mean 500 people have died. It's probably 5,000 people. Because half of the people that are dying are wandering around. They're fleeing violence. They're out in the forest somewhere, they come down with Ebola. There's no medical treatment, they're going to fucking die out in the woods. They will die. Secondary infection is a big problem. When you start bleeding out of your every orifice, it could be a little bit of a problem if you don't have high food and water availability. Especially if you get cholera at the same time, or malaria or something. When half your population has malaria or some other major chronic problem anyway, it tends to lower the immune system. So yeah, you get a huge problem. Then they're like, well, we'll deploy a vaccine. Well, again, Ebola has shown a readiness to evolve over time, a readiness to mutate. It's going to be very difficult to deploy a vaccine in a manner that will actually help. Because again, somebody eats some random bat or a piece of chimpanzee meat, gets Ebola. How are you going to know preemptively that that area even necessarily has a reservoir of the disease? You probably don't even know half the time. Some of these villages out in remote Africa are still basically only in the most sporadic contact with the outside world. Millions and millions of people all across sub-Saharan Africa still live in villages. There are no roads. There's a dirt path. They walk 10 miles in order to get to the nearest gas station. Maybe they have to walk 100 miles to get to the nearest school. There's no modernity. There's no uplink to society. If a village like that gets Ebola, the only time you're going to know that it even happened is if, one person manages to survive and get to the next city and then possibly spreads it there. The world better get serious because of the porosity of the borders. World trade and travel is generally a good thing, but as far as disease goes, it's a bad thing. We need to start thinking about that. We need to start thinking about better medical security at our borders, in all manners. We need to start thinking about the world cooperating more to try to snuff this kind of disease out. Look, the number of actual Ebola cases over the last century is astonishingly low. It's not prevalent. We know what the basic reservoirs are. We can take care of this issue, but it requires investment and in time and manpower and effort, which I don't see the world supplying. Instead, it's a reactionary sort of response that we do. Oh, there's an Ebola outbreak, we go and do something about it. The only reason, by the way, that they're trying to develop serums and vaccines is because in the last major outbreak in West Africa, they thereafter, and I predicted this months before they released this info, it was clear that the virus had mutated. It was clear that it was no longer the same grandma's Ebola. It was more infectious, and they never fully owned up to how that was. It was able to infect, and it had about the same death rate, about 40-50%, which is quite high. It mutated. They then admitted that it had mutated twice. Over the course of a few tens of thousands of infections, it mutated twice. That's a high mutation rate. They never thought that that was the case before. They never expected. They thought, well, Ebola is just Ebola. It's a bad virus, but ultimately it's not going to go pandemic. It's not infectious enough. Oh, but it was basically one mutation away from being the next Black Plague. Whoops, I guess we better develop a vaccine now. The problem is I challenge whether the world's capable of deploying it properly. And yet, how do you know that they'll even do it in time? You could have an outbreak. In this particular outbreak, any individual patient could lead to the rise of a mutant that's 100 times more infectious, goes fully airborne. All of a sudden, you don't have 500 people dead, you have 5 million people dead in the course of a few months. It is possible for that to happen. And trust me, the fact that it's over there, so it doesn't matter. Dude, it could spread quickly enough. It'd be like, what's that, The Stand by Stephen King. Basic gist, spoiler alert, basic gist of the story, you've got a super virus that gets accidentally released from a military base, kills off like 99% of the world. Then Satan takes up residence in Las Vegas and they have to nuke him or something. It's a really strange plot towards the end, but the basic idea is quite novel. It's a very good book, by the way. Movie, not so much. They desperately need to remake it without the shitty CGI and acting. It's a terrible made-for-TV style movie. Absolutely horrible. The intro is the only good part to the whole fucking thing, because it skipped over most of the book where they're trying to scrape together society. That was what made the book good. But it could happen. Yes, you can have a situation where 90% of humanity gets wiped out. What are you going to do in that situation? Some people joke about it. They're like, well, I'll just do more canning and well, there's less people. I'll take over my neighbor's land and there'll be stuff everywhere and it'll be hilarious. No, probably you'll end up getting killed is the problem. Because in the breakdown of order thereafter, all of the normal rules and regulations that keep the psychos at bay aren't there. Well, do you have a gun? No? Well, then you're fucked. Do you know how to grow food? No? You're fucked. Are you near something that you can scavenge for the basic supplies you'll need while you wait for your crops to grow? No? You're probably fucked. You got a big family, a lot of people around you for extra defense? Oh, wait, most of them died, so you're still fucked. Yeah, just wait for all those domesticated animals to get rabies in the wake of that. You're going to have a difficult fucking time if you don't have a good wall around your property. Trust me, these are things that I think of. By the way, After the Ashes, very good book written by yours truly. You should get a copy. You can find it on Amazon. No, I figured I'd plug that. It's related, though. Ebola is no fucking joke. You get 500 people dead here. You had thousands and thousands of people died in the West African outbreak. It basically destroyed the economies of those 3 affected nations. They're still rebuilding now. Sierra Leone has no real economy anymore. It was starting to develop a little bit, some tourism, a little bit of light industry. It's all gone. It got completely wasted. Their medical apparatus collapsed completely. The same will happen in the Congo if we're not careful. That's about all. Peace out.